We tend to believe that action movies are engineered machines precision-built, perfectly timed, the result of a production that knows exactly what it is doing from the first slate to the final shot. But the truth hiding beneath that polished mythology is far more fragile, far more chaotic, and far more human. Hollywood likes to pretend that order is the natural state of filmmaking, yet some of its most explosive action films were stitched together from confusion, desperation, and scenes shot so wildly out of sequence that even the cast no longer understood what story they were living in. Directors rewrote scripts in the middle of the desert. Actors delivered emotional breakdowns before filming the scenes that were meant to cause them. Studios watched deadlines collapse as crews tried to maintain continuity inside productions that moved like storms, unpredictable, contradictory, and often one mistake away from total disaster. On screen, these movies feel smooth, coherent, sometimes even iconic. Off-screen, they were battles of psychology and logistics. Every day on set risked unraveling everything that came before it. What happens when the scene meant to close a character's arc is shot on the very first day? What happens when the biggest stunt is captured before the actors even understand their roles? And what does it truly mean when a film looks seamless, yet behind the camera everyone was scrambling to keep the narrative from fracturing completely? Tonight, we step behind that curtain. These are not just stories about action movies, they are stories about near collapse, about productions held together by instinct, fear, and the sheer stubbornness of artists who refuse to let chaos win. Let us enter the world of 15 Hollywood action films shot so wildly out of sequence that they almost fell apart. Fact has shown Mad Max, Fury Road, 2015. Imagine stepping onto a set where no one, not even the director, can explain which emotional state your character is supposed to be in. That was the daily reality on Mad Max, Fury Road, a film whose production unfolded like a fever dream across the Namibian desert. George Miller had a storyboard for nearly every frame, yet the brutal environment forced the crew to shoot the film in fragments, skipping entire chunks of narrative because winds shifted, dunes moved, and equipment failed under the heat. Scenes meant to occur at the emotional peak of the story were captured long before the actors understood how their characters would evolve. Tom Hardy, lost inside the character's psychological maze, clashed repeatedly with Miller. He accused the director of improvising an incoherent vision, unaware that Miller himself was trying to piece together a movie that refused to obey traditional structure. Charlize Theron later admitted that she and Hardy were often playing two different movies without knowing it. Every day, the continuity team fought to map emotional beats on a story that was never filmed in order. The irony is that this chaos became the movie's greatest strength. When Miller finally stitched the fragments together in post-production, the disorientation, the fractured emotions, the sense of drifting through a feverish apocalypse, everything aligned. What could have collapsed became a new form of cinematic rhythm. But the desert wasn't the only place where sequence fell apart. Another franchise, built on precision and paranoia, would face its own unraveling. Fact Hash 2, The Bourne Ultimatum, 2007. For a series obsessed with clarity, speed, and razor-sharp intelligence, The Bourne Ultimatum was constructed in a fog. Paul Greengrass rewrote entire sections of the script while cameras were rolling, tearing out pages minutes before the actors were called to set. Matt Damon often performed scenes without knowing whether they belonged to the beginning or the end of Bourne's psychological descent. Lines changed, motivations shifted, and emotional beats were reinvented on the spot. Because locations were scattered across multiple continents, the schedule demanded that some of the story's final confrontations be filmed before the scenes that set them up. Damon recalled finishing an intense chase sequence and then immediately shooting a quieter moment that, narratively, was supposed to occur days earlier, yet he had no idea what his character had just experienced. Editors later described the production as assembling a puzzle without knowing what picture it was supposed to make. Greengrass embraced the confusion, arguing that it mirrored Bourne's fractured identity. The studio did not. Universal feared they were funding a film that could not be edited into coherence, especially when major sequences had to be reshot multiple times with different emotional tones. Strangely, the final film emerged sharper than anyone expected. The chaos gave it urgency. The disorientation made the action feel lived rather than choreographed. Yet nothing could prepare Hollywood for what happened next. A film where the script wasn't the problem, but the actors' schedules tore the story apart before a single stunt was even staged. Fact Hash 3, Die Hard with a Vengeance, 1995. On the surface, the third Die Hard looks effortlessly kinetic, unfolding like one long, breathless chase across New York City. Behind the scenes, it was a patchwork of contradictions. Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson, two stars with conflicting schedules, forced the crew to shoot large, emotional moments long before they knew how their characters' relationship would evolve. Director John McTiernan frequently shot climactic confrontations on Mondays, then returned on Friday to film scenes that, in the final cut, appeared hours earlier in the narrative. The script itself was a reworked thriller, not originally written for John McClane, so as the schedule collapsed, pages were rewritten nightly to make the story feel coherent. Willis often arrived on set, not knowing which version of a scene he was performing. Jackson later joked that he relied on wardrobe to figure out which level of panic he was supposed to be playing. Entire sequences were shot with actors delivering intensity meant for the finale, only to then pivot into banter intended for the story's opening act. Producers feared the tonal inconsistency would destroy the film. Continuity supervisors warned that too many emotional peaks were happening before the narrative had earned them. Yet somehow, in the editing room, the broken pieces clicked. The frantic, disordered shoot created a rawness that perfectly matched New York's chaotic energy. But if Die Hard with a Vengeance survived its own disorder, the next film would face a different kind of threat, one where the emotional timeline of a legendary character was shattered before the camera ever rolled. Fact Cancelletto 4 Casino Royale, 2006. It is easy to forget that Casino Royale was not merely the rebirth of James Bond, it was a gamble made under suffocating pressure. Daniel Craig stepped into a legacy shadowed by decades of expectations, yet the production forced him to perform his most emotionally draining scenes before he even understood who his Bond truly was. Because of location constraints and a tight shooting window in the Bahamas, the torture sequence, arguably one of the darkest emotional climaxes in the franchise, was filmed weeks before many of the lighter, introductory moments that define early Bond. Craig admitted that he struggled to calibrate Bond's psychological journey. How wounded should he be? How naive? How detached? Sometimes the crew shot scenes meant to occur after Bond's emotional breaking point, long before the character had even met Vesper on camera. Director Martin Campbell, juggling weather issues and studio deadlines, reshuffled the order so aggressively that the continuity team created color-coded charts just to track Bond's inner life hour by hour. The irony, of course, is that the final film feels meticulously structured. The emotional through line appears seamless, even elegant, but beneath that surface was an actor forced to reverse engineer a character while the ground shifted beneath him. And if Bond's identity was challenged by sequence alone, what happened on the next production would test the very boundaries between actor and character, blurring them in ways that still haunt cinema. Fact #5 The Dark Knight, 2008. Few productions carry the mythic aura of The Dark Knight, but legend often hides the disorder that shaped it. Heath Ledger's schedule, combined with Christopher Nolan's insistence on preserving secrecy, led to a shoot where the Joker's emotional arc was fractured into scattered fragments. Many scenes that appear late in the film taunting monologues, moments of chilling stillness were captured within the first weeks of production. Ledger delivered raw, unnerving intensity before the rest of the cast had even settled into their roles. When a warehouse fire destroyed several constructed sets, Nolan was forced to rewrite portions of the schedule overnight. Key confrontations had to be filmed without the scenes that explained their buildup. Christian Bale often arrived on set, asking which version of Batman he was supposed to play, the calculating tactician or the shaken, reactive vigilante. The disarray was particularly brutal on the editing team, who described the Joker's timeline as a mosaic of moods that required surgical precision to assemble. And yet, that fractured approach helped create one of cinema's most iconic villains. The Joker's unpredictability, his emotional whiplash, his sense of being everywhere at once. These qualities emerged organically from a production where no one ever saw the full picture at the same time. But the next film would descend even further into fragmentation, pushed not by secrecy or disaster, but by the relentless ambition of a director who demanded more from his cast and crew than time or logic could support. Fact #6 Terminator 2, Judgment Day, 1991. James Cameron approached Terminator 2 the way a general approaches war, with total commitment, unlimited ambition, and a belief that impossible schedules can bend to willpower. But even Cameron could not control the brutal combination of location, logistics, actor injuries, and effects-driven delays that tore the shooting order apart. Arnold Schwarzenegger filmed gentle protector moments before he ever shot the scenes that revealed the T-800's transformation from killer to guardian. Linda Hamilton's emotional intensity as Sarah Connor shifted wildly because scenes meant to trace her descent into paranoia were often filmed after sequences that showed her regaining control. Production moved between smelting plants, hospitals, deserts, and practical effects workshops with no regard for narrative progression. Continuity binders ballooned into hundreds of pages. Crew members privately wondered whether the film would feel like a series of disjointed set pieces stitched together by hope. What saved it was Cameron's obsessive clarity about theme. Even when nothing was shot in order, he understood the emotional shape he wanted. Fear turning to trust, chaos turning to defiance. In post-production, the fragments finally aligned, forming the emotional backbone that made Terminator 2 not only coherent, but revolutionary. But if Cameron wrestled chaos into triumph, the next production would face a different challenge altogether, one where the very concept of sequence collapsed under the weight of a narrative built on time loops and repeated deaths. Fact #7 Edge of Tomorrow, 2014. There are films that challenge actors physically, and then there are films that dismantle their sense of narrative reality. Edge of Tomorrow belonged entirely to the second category. Because the story revolves around time loops, repetitive deaths, resets, and emotional calibrations, the production collapsed into a labyrinth where no one could remember which version of the day they were filming. Tom Cruise often performed 6 or 7 emotional intensities for the same moment, not knowing whether this iteration represented his character's early panic or seasoned acceptance. Director Doug Liman embraced experimentation, rewriting scene structures while cameras were rolling. Locations became available at unpredictable intervals, forcing the crew to shoot late-stage loops before earlier ones had even been conceptualized. Emily Blunt sometimes jumped from portraying Rita as an intimidating mentor to a reluctant ally, and then back again, all within a single afternoon. Continuity charts became useless. They were rewritten so frequently that the team abandoned them in favor of instinct. The chaos seeped into the film's identity. Every reset felt jarring because the production itself lived in a perpetual loop of uncertainty. And yet, when assembled, the fragments formed a strange cohesion. The fractured shoot mirrored the fractured narrative. But if time loops shattered structure in one movie, the next production would be undone by a different force, an all-consuming stunt that forced an unfinished script into the hands of a crew racing against a clock they could not control. Fact Comaut, Mission Impossible, Rogue Nation, 2015. Most action films save their most dangerous stunt for last. Rogue Nation did the opposite. The now famous hanging off an Airbus sequence, arguably the film's most extreme image, was shot before Christopher McQuarrie had even finalized the script. Tom Cruise insisted on performing the stunt immediately because of weather conditions and aircraft availability. So the production began with the movie's climax, before the narrative spine, character arcs, or emotional through lines existed. Cruise executed multiple takes hanging onto the plane as it ascended, while the rest of the team scrambled to imagine what story could possibly justify such an opening. As the shoot progressed, McQuarrie rewrote entire plot lines to retroactively support footage already captured. Injuries later forced Cruise to delay other scenes, reversing the intended flow even further. Romantic beats were shot before the characters had met, betrayals before trust had been established, and motivations before they were written. Paramount panicked. Executives warned that the narrative was being built backwards, assembled around stunts rather than structure. But McQuarrie, like a puzzle maker working from the edges inward, gradually shaped the disordered scenes into a coherent thriller. The production survived its own stunt-driven chaos, but the next film faced a more elemental obstacle: speed itself. When momentum became the central theme, the crew learned that shooting out of sequence could break more than continuity. It could fracture the very rhythm the film relied on. Fact #9 Speed, 1994. Speed may be one of the cleanest, most propulsive action films ever made, but its production was anything but linear. The iconic bus sequences meant to represent a constant escalation of danger were shot in pieces so disjointed that Keanu Reeves often had no idea whether his character was supposed to be calm, frantic, or seconds from losing control. Filming depended entirely on which stretches of Los Angeles freeways were available each day. turning the narrative into a mosaic of fragments stitched together by geography rather than story. Some of the film's most explosive scenes, including the early detonation that sets the plot in motion, were shot deep into production. Meanwhile, quieter exchanges between Jack and Annie were captured before the actors had developed their on-screen rapport. Director Jan de Bont fought to maintain the illusion of rising tension, while filming out of order threatened to flatten the emotional curve entirely. The crew tried to build continuity maps, but the shifting locations made them useless. Reeves later said he constructed Jack's emotional arc from intuition alone, because the sequence he filmed on Monday might end up 40 minutes earlier or later in the final cut. Miraculously, the editing room transformed chaos into momentum. The fragmented production created a jagged, restless energy that perfectly matched the film's premise: a vehicle trapped in perpetual motion. But the challenges faced by Speed would pale in comparison to the next production, where weather, tone, and last-minute rewrites tested the emotional coherence of an iconic buddy cop duo. Fact Hassan Zero Lethal Weapon 21989. There is a certain loose, chaotic charm that defines the Lethal Weapon series, but behind the camera of the second film, the chaos was far from control. Weather disruptions in Los Angeles forced director Richard Donner to shoot major emotional scenes whenever the sun happened to cooperate, regardless of where they fit in the script. As a result, Mel Gibson filmed moments of Riggs at his most unhinged before shooting earlier scenes, where the character is far lighter, almost relaxed. Danny Glover faced the opposite problem. Some of Murtaugh's comedic beats were shot after the actor had just completed an intense sequence meant to push the character toward exhaustion. The tonal whiplash affected the entire cast, who relied on last-minute script pages to guess what emotional temperature they were supposed to inhabit. Meanwhile, rewrites sparked partly by studio pressure and partly by the need to compensate for weather delays reshuffled the story so many times that even the continuity team couldn't track which version they were in. At one point, producers feared that the emotional pacing was collapsing, with climactic moments being filmed without the build-up that justified them. And yet, when the film reached post-production, the fractured footage formed a surprisingly coherent narrative. The intensity and looseness born from necessity became part of the chemistry fans would come to love. But Lethal Weapon 2 was hardly the only film whose ambitious world-building was threatened by a shattered shooting schedule. The next movie, one that redefined action and science fiction, would face disruptions that nearly derailed its revolutionary vision. Fact Hassanon. The Matrix, 1999. The Matrix presented an entirely new language of cinema philosophical, hyper-stylized, meticulously choreographed, but the journey to create it was anything but orderly. Before filming began, Keanu Reeves suffered a neck injury that limited his physical movements. As a result, the Wachowskis were forced to shoot many of Neo's intense fight sequences months before they filmed the quieter, contemplative dialogues that established his awakening. Lawrence Fishburne and Carrie-Anne Moss both described arriving on set unsure whether they were shooting scenes from the beginning, middle, or end of the story. The production jumped between the real world and the Matrix simulation based on location availability, not narrative logic. In some cases, the iconic bullet time shots were captured long before the story had naturally built to the moment where Neo begins to understand his abilities. Complicating matters further, the Wachowskis continued refining the script as philosophical themes deepened. Scenes filmed early often contradicted newer ideas, requiring later reshoots and clever editing to maintain coherence. The editing team worked with footage that felt like different versions of the same universe, each slightly out of sync with the others. And yet, the schizophrenia of the shoot somehow amplified the film's themes. Neo's confusion, the bending of reality, the sense of living inside a fractured world, they were mirrored by the production's fractured process. But for all of the Matrix's philosophical complexity, the next film confronted a more tangible problem: the absence of a finished script, forcing actors to improvise their way through a narrative that didn't yet exist. Fact numeral uno dos Iron Man 2008. It's hard to imagine now, but the film that launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe began in near total uncertainty. Iron Man entered production without a complete script, leaving Robert Downey Jr. to improvise many of Tony Stark's most defining lines. Because the story was being built on the fly, scenes were filmed whenever the team managed to finalize a few pages, often out of order, often with emotional cues that weren't yet connected to anything. Jon Favreau encouraged Downey and Gwyneth Paltrow to experiment, which made the performances feel spontaneous, but wreaked havoc on narrative continuity. Some of Tony and Pepper's most vulnerable exchanges were shot long before the events that were supposed to inspire them had been written. Meanwhile, action sequences were filmed based on which effects teams were available that week, not based on their narrative placement. Marvel, still new to large-scale filmmaking, watched nervously as footage piled up. Editors later admitted that assembling the movie felt like discovering the plot through archaeology. Scenes that were meant to be turning points had been shot before the emotional groundwork existed at all. Ironically, the improvisational chaos became part of the film's charm. Tony Stark's unpredictability, his rapid-fire humor, his emotional volatility, all emerged from a production barely held together by instinct. But the next film in our list is one where instinct, ambition, and scheduling collided with something more dangerous. A cast so large and a shoot so fragmented that not even the director could predict which version of the story he was capturing each day. Fact Hasson 3, The Expendables, 2010. When a film gathers some of the biggest action stars of an era, one expects the chaos to erupt on screen, not behind it. But The Expendables quickly became a logistical battlefield long before a single explosion was staged. With Sylvester Stallone directing and starring, while also juggling the schedules of Jason Statham, Jet Li, Dolph Lundgren, Terry Crews, and numerous cameos, almost no two actors were available at the same time. This forced the production to shoot scenes built around absences. Fights were choreographed before the story explaining them was finalized. Emotional beats that should have reflected shared history were shot separately on different weeks, with Stallone later stitching them together in editing. Injuries complicated everything. Stallone tore several tendons early on, requiring parts of the shoot to be rearranged so he could film less physical material while simultaneously directing high-intensity sequences. Many scenes intended for the climax were captured first because the locations would not be available later. Meanwhile, the comedic banter meant to grow organically from the team dynamic was filmed before relationships between the cast had even formed. Producers feared the film would feel like a collage of disconnected characters, yet Stallone, drawing from decades of action film instinct, pieced together a narrative that embraced its rough edges. The fractured shoot created a raw, unpolished energy that felt true to the film's mercenary spirit. But if The Expendables struggled under the weight of too many stars, the next film faced an entirely different enemy, the unforgiving chaos of nature itself. Fact Hasson for Rambo, First Blood Part 2, 1985. The jungles of Mexico, doubling for Vietnam, were as much a character in Rambo, First Blood Part 2, as Sylvester Stallone himself. But the environment quickly turned into an adversary. Tropical storms tore through sets, forcing the crew to film whatever scenes the weather allowed, regardless of where they belonged in the story. One day, Stallone would perform Rambo's most explosive, vengeance-driven rampage. The next day, he would be asked to return to early scenes where the character was still emotionally contained. The emotional inconsistency pushed Stallone to reconstruct Rambo's internal arc from instinct rather than chronology. The political dimension of the production added even more instability. Studio executives demanded changes to reflect U.S. sentiment at the time, prompting last-minute script revisions that upended the order of scenes already filmed. Some moments intended to serve as character pivots were displaced, leaving the crew unsure how to balance intensity and vulnerability from one shoot day to the next. Continuity supervisors warned that the emotional logic of the film was unraveling. Yet when assembled, the disorder created a strange authenticity. Rambo's disorientation, his simmering rage, his sense of being caught between states of mind, all were amplified by the fractured shoot. Still, no amount of adaptive instinct could prepare the industry for the next production, where political instability didn't merely rewrite scenes, it threatened the film's very survival. Fact Hasson 5, Behind Enemy Lines, 2001. Production on Behind Enemy Lines was marked by a constant sense of danger, a feeling that seeped into every decision and ultimately fractured the shoot. Filming in Eastern Europe, near regions still recovering from the Bosnian conflict, meant that certain locations were safe one day and off-limits the next. The crew often had only hours' notice before a set had to be evacuated, forcing director John Moore to capture whatever scenes he could in whatever location remained available. This tore the narrative structure apart almost instantly. Owen Wilson's emotional arc as Lieutenant Burnett, fear, panic, desperation, determination, had to be performed in a whirlwind of mismatched sequences. Some of the character's most traumatized scenes were filmed before the events that were supposed to cause that trauma. Meanwhile, Gene Hackman's scenes, restricted by his limited availability, were shot early, before the full story had settled into shape. As a result, The tension between the film's two narrative threads was constructed almost entirely in post-production. Adding to the turmoil, political sensitivities forced sudden changes to the depiction of certain factions. Scenes were rewritten hours before shooting, leaving the cast unsure of motivations or alliances. Editors later said the raw footage felt like three versions of the same film accidentally mixed together. And yet, from the chaos emerged a thriller whose jagged momentum felt eerily appropriate. The story of a man running for his life, trapped in unpredictable territory, created by a crew fighting the same instability. Bonus fact: hard target, 1,993. The movie too chaotic even for the countdown. Asterisk. Some productions collapse quietly, others implode so spectacularly that Hollywood pretends they never happened. Hard Target, John Woo's first American film, belonged to the second category, a project so disordered that it could not fit neatly into any list, not even one about films shot out of sequence. What made it unique was not that scenes were filmed out of order, but that every single version of the film seemed to belong to a different universe. Jean-Claude Van Damme and Woo clashed from the start. Woo brought his meticulous Hong Kong sensibilities, crafting balletic action sequences that required precision and continuity. Van Damme, however, pushed for changes that emphasized his star persona, demanding reshoots, line alterations, and expanded close-ups. Because the studio sided inconsistently sometimes with Woo, sometimes with Van Damme, scenes were reconfigured daily, creating three competing versions of the same narrative. Entire plot lines were shot before being abandoned. Emotional beats were captured without any understanding of where they would land in the final film. Some of the most elaborate action sequences were filmed early but later re-edited to fit a different emotional context or cut entirely. Editors described receiving reels of footage that contradicted one another, as if the movie had been shot by two directors with opposing philosophies. When the studio demanded a more American tone, Woo was forced into last-minute rewrites and additional shoots, further fracturing the continuity. By the end, the final cut was assembled like a salvage operation, pulling coherence from rubble. It didn't make the top 15 because its disorder wasn't just structural, it was existential. Hard Target wasn't filmed out of sequence. It was rebuilt from the ruins of a film that had never existed in sequence to begin with. When you look back at these productions, one question becomes impossible to avoid. Were these films saved by talent or simply by luck? Chaos leaves fingerprints on performances, on editing rooms, on the stories we think we understand. Some of these movies survived because their casts adapted. Others survived because editors performed miracles. But the truth behind them is still unsettling. Which of these productions shocked you the most? And do you believe the final films reflect artistic intention or the desperate improvisation of crews fighting to hold collapsing narratives together?